This is recording. Darryl, we are live. Welcome to my podcast. How you feeling tonight?
You know what? I'm feeling all right. I'm glad to be here.
Yes, I'm glad you are here because I think, like you just said a little bit earlier, I think we're going to have a good conversation just because this is one of the topics-ish that I kind of felt like I've had trouble with growing up. Just I've never felt like I was a
Okay.
trusting person, and I've always had questions about it. Maybe who, what, where. I guess the big whys. Why do I have trust issues? And across all
Right.
spectrums, not just relationships, but work relationships and just in all different areas of my life. But before we start digging and going too far, why don't you just give the audience, listeners, a little bit of a quick background about you, just so they kind of know what we're getting into here?
Sure. So I was born and raised in a small town in northern Canada, fairly isolated. And because the conditions were pretty harsh, people had to pull together.
Sure.
And I always had the sense that if you could help someone, you should. And so uh, I grew up, in a fairly rugged environment. Had a fairly challenging time as a young man or as a youth, um, in part because of my father had been in an automobile accident when I was quite young, lost his leg, broke his hip, cracked his pelvis, crushed several vertebrae in his back, and he was in pain for the rest of his life. And so he struggled with that and self-medicated with alcohol. It created a challenging environment. When I was 17, I was playing junior hockey, and I got jumped by a fan with a club, shattered my helmet, knocked me unconscious. Not good.
Yeah.
And so that background led me to have, I guess, more empathy than most. And I moved to Victoria, on Vancouver Island, to go to school. And I found that people would just come up to me and sit down next to me and say, I'm having a hard time. I'd be on the bus and a stranger would sit down next to me and say, I'm really having a tough day. And I thought, if this is going to keep happening to me, maybe I should get paid for this. Um, so
I agree.
So I started down the path towards becoming a clinical psychologist. And I kind of wanted to understand why people just felt comfortable opening up to me, and why people seem so comfortable with me. And so I was working on crisis lines and working with families in crisis and troubled teens and street kids, and trying to hone those skills. And then I realized that a lot of the people I was working with were just doing the best they could. It was easy to see a path forward for them, a way for them to get from A to B, but it had taken them a long time to get where they were. It was going to take them a long time to turn things around. And I thought that'll drive me insane. Sure. And so I shifted into public admin, started working in native land claims, and they would ask me these deep philosophical questions like, what is self-government? Or what will it look like 50 years after claims are settled with natives? And the last question they asked me was, how do we convince a group of people we've shafted for over 100 years they should trust us?
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, that's a really good question.
It is.
And so I went to Duke and wrote my doctoral thesis on building trust in hostile environments at the business school there. And and so I ended up leaving there, going to Mckinsey Company, which is one of the larger management consulting firms. And they said, wow, you've got good client hands. Let's send you to the worst places possible. And so I would end up in places where there'd been strikes or where people weren't getting along, and so I was getting a chance to apply the material that I'd learned, that I'd theorized about. And then I was injured in a car accident. Ended up with post-concussion syndrome, couldn't pull those kinds of hours anymore.
Yeah.
And so I started my own little company called Trust Unlimited. And I've spent the last 20 years helping people understand what trust is and how it works, and most importantly, how to build it.
That was a whole lot right there, Darryl. Yeah.
That's a lot. Sorry, I kind of went on for a bit there, didn't I?
No, it was good stuff. I have a couple questions like I was thinking of while you were talking, and I was losing. But when you started, going down the route or route, whatever you want to say, that of helping people, and knew that, people were opening up to you. And I think you said something about you kind of wanted to figure out why, people would open up to you. Just, you like you said, you were just sitting on a bench one day and somebody came up and started talking to you. I mean,
Right.
what did you conclude? I mean, after your experience and your life journey, I mean, what did you come to realize? Hey, why do people like to come tell me or
It's
open
a
up? 'Cause
really good question.
it's really hard for people to do that, especially with a stranger, just to go sit down
Yeah.
to say, "Hey, man,
And
life sucks," or something.
well, there's still an element of that in me when, I'm teaching or I'm at school. My students will say, "You seem strong but safe." Right? There's this blend of strength in you, but no menace. And I think partly there's an openness to me. Uh, there's a friendliness that I start. I have a positive story about people and human beings in general. Um, and I think people feel that.
Yeah,
Neuro-linguistic programming would probably suggest that there's a way that I hold myself, that a way that my body language, those kinds of things, that's very open and welcoming and warm. I care about people and it shows up. So I think that there's an element of that we sense in one another.
sure.
And it's not to say that I'm, always nice. I'm not. Um, there are times when I can become very protective. Um, and I don't like bullies.
Of course.
Yeah. So, I think that people just get that sense from me that I'm friendly and that I'm caring and that I want to be helpful.
And I'm glad you are putting off that sense into a perspective, just because it seems like in the modern world today, there's not a lot of trust that can go on, especially, it's one of those
Yeah.
walking up to a stranger and opening up to them, and just thinking that you might have a good read on the person, saying, "Oh yeah, this guy seems strong and trustworthy and safe," but could just be one of these Machiavellian tactics where somebody just use or not Machiavellian, but manipulative tactics where people just go and take advantage of somebody just because they earn their trust or whatever. And I don't know if that's just because of the modern world compared to 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, before social media,
Yeah.
phones, before, if I were to say something about, the type of day I had, something that was very personal to me, and then you could instantly tweet it and I'll be on the whole world in a matter of seconds. So do you think, I guess that's my next question though, do you think that just being in this, I guess, era of time, it's harder for people to trust, and not only just on a personal level, but trust their relatives, friends, and then take that trust into the workplace itself?
Yes. Yeah. I think it's harder for a number of reasons. The things that we used to do. So we all have the ability to build trust. Some are just better than others, right? And those who aren't very good have a lever that they pull, and they pull it over and over again. And those who are better have multiple levers that they pull. And those who are really good have multiple levers and they know when to pull which one. The struggle we face right now is, as you point out, our vulnerabilities are different than they used to be. So, I can make a mistake and the whole world knows about it.
Exactly.
Or I can even maybe not make a mistake, but have something that someone can frame in a way that sounds like I've made a mistake.
Sure.
And people don't give me the benefit of the doubt the way that they maybe once would have. Historically, our communities were much tighter than they are now because we didn't have as much access to the rest of the world as we do with social media. And so if I screwed up, it was more likely that people knew my background, they knew my history, they could interpret my actions through that lens. And there was also a chance for me to recover, right? To make amends, to mitigate the damage that I've done.
Of course.
There's less of that now. And for me, trust is a combination of uncertainty and vulnerability. So when we're deciding to trust people, we ask ourselves two fundamental questions. One is, how likely am I to be harmed? And this, which is perceived uncertainty. And the second question is, if I'm harmed, how bad is it going to hurt? Which is perceived vulnerability. And we've seen significant spikes in uncertainty. We just don't tend to know each other as well. And, our relationships are a mile wide and an inch deep. And so we've had this huge spike in uncertainty. And we're seeing changing values and norms. We're seeing, a pandemic hits us. We're seeing technological advances and changes. And so there's just these spikes all over the place of uncertainty that are making us incredibly uncomfortable. And so we need to be more thoughtful and intentional than we've ever had to be. But we combine that with a lot of people not knowing how to do that.
I like that saying you just said, that our relationships are a mile wide but an inch deep.
Yeah.
And that makes so much sense because, again, kind of touching on social media and things of that nature, where people put, and I'm generally speaking, of course, averagely,
Yeah.
most people will put their focus into their followers and likes, in which, they have 1,000, 10,000, 20,000 followers, whatever.
Right.
But really, when you said an inch deep, like, how really does a person know their followers? I mean, it's just, you're basing everything on that and just saying that, oh, and like, if you boast about having 4,000 people who follow you on social media, it's, well, do you even know these people? I mean, you don't know what type
Right.
of following, and what kind of, and I guess taking it back to trust, though, I mean, but out of those 4,000 people, if you had to go and relay some type of information to them, how many of them would you actually trust with that?
Right. And
And
how loyal would they be if something went wrong?
exactly,
Would they be there for you if you all of a sudden were struggling with something?
exactly. Do you know who? And I don't. This is kind of a tangent, but do you know who the Liver King is by chance?
No.
Okay, so real quick, I mean, I don't want to go down a deep path on this, but this kind of brings me to this example that he's a big Instagram influencer, and his whole background, his whole thing he advertises is about following the ancestral ways of life, basically, where
Okay.
you eat raw meat, you eat raw liver, you go outside and you work out, you get so many hours of sunshine, things like that. Be true to your word, integrity, have a good community, kind of trust, just things like this, like that.
Sure.
And he said he's got a supplement line and sells. I think he sells workouts. Like, don't quote me on that. But anyway, it came out this past week about him. He looks great. He walks everywhere with his shirt off. He's got 8-pack abs basically defined,
Right.
beard, and that's how he's selling everything. So, but it came out. Long story short, it came out this week that he's been using steroids for over a year, and that's the reason
Right.
he looks what he likes. And he has a huge following, and he's trying to sell all these people, technically what he does to look like the way he does, But
Right.
now, in my opinion, I don't know how many people his followers left or dropped him off or whatever, but he had to send out a huge apology, basically just talking about, hey, I'm sorry for what I did. I didn't even, have my own integrity in hand. I just let everyone down. But so something like that, where people were really buying into something like that, and they didn't really know who this guy was, but whatever, they were just kind of picking up just what he was selling. And I hope that kind of made sense at that point. And I hope that
it absolutely does. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. Yeah. And so we see, for me, the model that I use, like I said, trust is the willingness to make yourself vulnerable when you can't completely predict how someone else is going to behave.
Sure.
And so people make themselves vulnerable to this Liver King guy by buying his supplements, by subscribing to his channel, by spending time and energy and resources focusing on his approach to life and adopting it, believing that they're headed in the direction that he's promised them.
Sure.
And then they find out that he's cheating.
Yes.
And there will inevitably be some who forgive him for that because of other messages that he shares and sends that they find compelling. But this is, and we've seen politicians just routinely lie and then lie again, right? And so we're struggling because the context of the world is propagating people who we shouldn't be following. The rules of the game are leading to us getting leaders who are, of political nature, or some of these social media leaders who are really focused on their own self-interest and not on what's best for those they lead.
I agree.
And so we get these, really profound narcissists. And when I was working for McKinsey, we talked to a number of political leaders in Canada, and we talked to a bunch of business leaders. And our thinking was we needed a business leader to be the next leader of Canada, a prime minister. And all of the ones we approached said, why would I take the pay cut? And why on earth would I put my family through that? And so a lot of times we see folks, and I've part of my work is I work with senior leaders, and a lot of them really struggle with moving up the ranks because they feel like it's a trade-off between their own goals and objectives and the well-being of their family. And so our structures are set up so that narcissists and people who are really prone to their own self-aggrandizement are the ones who vie for those positions. And the people who are perhaps more sensible, more guided by looking out for those that they lead, tend to stop at a certain point and say, this is far enough. I'm not willing to make the future trade-offs. And so, part of my work talks about uncertainty and vulnerability. Well, context is one of the pieces of uncertainty. I think about it as the formal rules and informal rules of the game that drive us to behave in certain ways. And a lot of times when I'm teaching a class, I'll say, if you could be anywhere with anyone doing anything right now, how many of you would be here listening to me? And I stopped doing that, Chris, because it wasn't good for my self-esteem. But, then the question becomes, why are you here?
Yeah.
Right? Why are you here with me? And usually it's because of the context. I need this credential. I've got a problem. I'm struggling with something. There's something going on in their environment that pushes them to want to seek out what I'm trying to deliver. And so for me, we can build trust by understanding the context that we each experience and face, because it helps us predict how someone else is going to behave. It helps reduce uncertainty about them. And you and I could actually take steps within the context to reduce uncertainty for one another. I could put up a peace bond, right? I can make public commitments to you.
Yes.
We could write a contract with one another that constrains our behavior so that it makes it easier for you and I to predict each other, which allows us to trust each other more.
Is that one of the issues? Like, if a person is very untrusting just because of past experience or whatever, that they need these steps and something like that to say, hey, it's kind of like taking baby steps here. We'll take step one, just like you said, and see how this works out. And that way I can earn your trust from there. And let's see how this plays out from there. I mean, is that just, is that what you would model? Oh, go ahead.
So what I would do, what I tend to do is, I lay out so I wrote a book called Building Trust. And in the book, I lay out sort of 10 levers that we can pull to build trust with other people. And as I was saying before, we each have the ability to build trust, but what I try to do is make people more aware of the different levers we can pull and then show them how to pull those, and then help them sort of diagnose. And so for me, trust, uncertainty times vulnerability gives us a level of perceived risk. And we each have a threshold of risk that we're comfortable with. And that threshold comes from our past experiences and our cultural heritage and the values and norms that we have. So there's things that go into that to make us either more or less trusting. If we believe that the risk goes beyond that threshold, we don't trust. And if it's beneath it, then we do. And so building trust is actually really simple. It's, where does uncertainty come from? And how do I take steps to reduce that? And where's the vulnerability coming from for the other person? And how do I take steps to help them manage that? And so there are 4 levers within uncertainty.
Okay.
And 3 of those come from you and I as individuals, right? So, and this is work that was done by a friend of mine, Roger Mayer, in 1995. Him and his colleagues proposed these 3 levers, and they are benevolence, integrity, and ability. And benevolence is, do you have my best interest at heart? And are you going to act in my best interest, even if it's not in your own short-term best interest? Integrity is, do I follow through on my promises, and do my values actually line up with the actions that I take? And then ability is, do I have the competence to do what I say I'm going to do? And so those are three of the levers. And then context is the other lever within uncertainty. And we talked briefly about context and how you and I could explain to each other how we're constrained and the values that we have and things that matter to us that would make it easier to predict. But I can also pull the benevolence lever. And at the start of this, you and I both were doing that. We were saying, what would a good experience look like for you?
Yes.
And you were asking me the same. What's a good experience look like for you? And so we're showing each other a bit of benevolence, right? I want this to be a successful podcast for you. I want you to walk away from this thinking, wow, that was really great. I hope my listeners really enjoyed that and got something from it.
Sure. I agree.
And so when we start thinking about how do we pull those levers, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll get people to practice in my workshops and in the masterclass that I do. I'll get them to practice pulling those levers. So I'll give them a template for a conversation. And for benevolence, it looks like this. You and I are having a conversation, and I say, well, this guy Darryl talked to me about benevolence. He said it's part of trust, and it means having someone's best interest at heart. I think I do that, but it doesn't always seem to land. Have you ever had that experience where you tried to do something in someone's interest and it didn't land?
Plenty of times.
And yeah, exactly. And so the other person will go, yeah, absolutely. And then I'll say, well, tell me about a time when somebody really did have your back. What did that look like? What did they do? How did it feel? And so now I've got you thinking about times when someone was looking out for you, someone was on your side, they were in your corner. And as you start telling me about that experience, I start getting hints. I start getting a sense of what benevolence looks like for you. And I've included you now in the conversation. And then I said, well, Chris, what would it look like if I was benevolent to you? What does success look like for you? And how do I help you get there? Can I introduce you to people? Can I promote the podcast? What can I do to help you be successful?
Sure.
And now all of a sudden it's transparent, right? And as we go along, I can refer back to it. And so that's how we pull the lever more effectively. And, I do that for each of those 4 uncertainty levers. When it comes to vulnerability, there's this understanding of what do I think is at stake, and then how do I value it? So what do I think is at stake with you and I having this conversation? Well, I'm going to share and be vulnerable and tell you stories about my life. People may think highly of me, or they may think, oh, that guy's he's weak. He was attacked by somebody and he wasn't able to fend them off, or, whatever, right? Or he's crying about, how hard his life was. And so there are me being open and honest and forthcoming with you. There's some people who are going to appreciate that and some people who may not.
Yes.
And so that's the vulnerability that I experience with you.
Yeah.
And then understanding our contexts, if me understanding your context allows you to build trust with me because it reduces my uncertainty. You understanding my context helps you understand how I'm vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yes.
And so we can take steps to actually be proactive and build trust with each other. It's like you said, these sort of baby steps where we're trying these different levers. We try benevolence, we try integrity, we try ability, we explain the context a little bit to reduce uncertainty. All of these things are ways. And for you, you said that you've struggled to have trust with others at times.
Yes.
There's also a series of questions you can ask that will make you more comfortable.
Ooh. Well, before
you can ask.
Yeah, I want to
go ahead.
I want to get into that, but as you were talking though, I was thinking about, how you thought based on what you were saying, there'll be people out there who would just might either think you're weak or why didn't he fight back or something like that. But, and it's easy for other people to do that when on the outside looking in. And I guess
right.
getting that from is that, I've heard on another podcast, somebody say, the worst thing that's ever happened to you is the worst thing that's ever happened to you. So for example,
right.
you getting attacked by a fan and they broke your helmet with a hockey stick or whatever. That's what I think you said. And then somebody
with a
else,
club. Yeah.
yeah, and somebody else who who didn't go down that same life path you did, or life journey or life experience, whatever you want to say. But, and the worst thing that ever happened to them was somebody cut them off in traffic, you know?
Right.
So it's really hard to relate like that. And for that person, I guess it really is to say, oh, if I would have been there, I probably would have, done X, Y, and Z or whatever. But it's really not that easy because you don't really know what you would have done. I mean, I guess it's fight or flight
Right.
or whatever. And
Yeah.
I don't really know what my point was to that was, but I guess it was just that, just trying, you can't, I guess there's so many opinions out there that everyone likes to say and talk about, they would done X, Y, and Z, but really, would you have that? I mean, and you don't, and people
Well, I got
about taking things out of context. You don't know. We don't even know the whole story. We just know, hey, the fan jumped
right.
out of there and just hit you over the head or whatever. That's all we know.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess that's my whole point.
Yeah.
They don't know every little detail and everything that was put together. So it's easy for somebody to say something about that especially when they've never gone through something to that extreme.
There's a profound point that comes from that, Chris, and that is that we interpret the world through stories.
Yes.
And so people may have a narrative of, I walked through the world untouchable. And I would have, so from my perspective, I got jumped from behind and the guy was much bigger than me. And the first shot to the back of the head, I was out. So I saw it on video. But, for me, the story is not around the assault or the attack. It's how I responded to it afterwards, after I'd been injured, after I'd suffered a severe concussion. There was every opportunity for me to just give up.
Of course.
And crawl into a hole and feel sorry for myself. I didn't do that. And it instead taught me empathy. It taught me an understanding for other people who are going through the helplessness, the hopelessness, the struggle, the pain that I went through. And so that's the story that I carry. And you're right. Everyone's got a different narrative. And this is one of the challenges that we face. Because after we make that trust decision, we have, perceived outcomes. And it's exactly that. It's our perception of what just happened. And your listeners are going to be listening to this, and some of them are going to find it profoundly meaningful. They're going to listen to the exact same podcast, and some of them are going to go, well, that wasn't that interesting to me. And so in part, this is another place where we can lean in. You and I are having this exchange, this positive experience. At least it's positive for me. And we can share our stories with each other so that we come up with a shared narrative of what's happened here. And then that feeds back into our next interaction, either with each other or people similar to us.
Yes.
And so our conversations around what's happened and narrative around the outcome and the expectation, it's part of that lever pulling process that I talk about. And it feeds back. And in the middle of all this is our emotional states, whether we like or dislike somebody else. And, you and I, you had a bit of technical snafu. You and I both kind of laughed about it before we even started, right? And so there's this positive feeling towards each other. This, I tend to like you.
Yes.
And so that makes me look for confirming evidence of that positive story that I have about you. And it makes me more likely to trust you. And it makes me more likely to see the outcomes of this experience as positive, which is going to make me like you even more. And so we start this virtuous cycle. And, this is where most of the trust literature treats people like they're rational actors. And we just aren't. And so this is why these long-term disputes are so resilient. The fight between Democrats and Republicans, the disagreements between the police and the communities they serve, the differences based on gender or race, climate change, all of these things, they become emotional. And we can't bring rational arguments to an emotional problem. Because when people start to dislike each other, they find confirming evidence for reasons not to like each other.
Yes.
and they don't trust each other, and they see the outcomes of those exchanges negatively, and it makes them like each other even less.
Do you think that's because maybe of propaganda marketing and trusting individuals who that they believe truly is like, like we just talked about the Liver King, but they're I don't want to say the almighty, but they're the all knowing, I guess. And that whatever they say is automatically great. They live in these echo chambers, but rather than going down and just doing research and looking at and seeing what the opposing viewpoint is of whether it be racism, climate change, COVID-19, just anything you ever
Right.
on. And then, but, and I guess, they put so much trust into this one person, whether it be, they get in their information from whoever they're like Elon Musk on Twitter, and whatever he's saying is, the
Right.
golden. And then somebody on the other side, they just don't even want to hear anything that could be like, well, I don't, even whether it just be like, well, I don't know quite like that. Let's dial it down a notch and think about it this way, just because it's an opposing viewpoint. Whereas, and we get locked into these chambers where it's so hard to even have these type of conversations, just because of people always wanting to be right. And
Yeah.
that's why maybe the world is so polarized now, just because. And I maybe I don't know where I'm going with this, but it's just standing on one side of one side of the road compared to the other one, just because they're putting so much trust into one person, even though they don't. It's probably the wrong person they should be trusting. Maybe that's
right. Well, and part of the challenge we face now, and I face this in my personal life, is the struggle we have to agree on even data, right? Even the facts, and the sources of information that we get that skew the message one way or another. And the undermining of people's trust in mainstream media. But the very people who undermine trust in mainstream media then tout information from fringe media like it's supposed to be more reliable somehow. And so we end up really struggling to even have the foundation for a discussion.
Yes.
And so a lot of times, approaches I take, I've got a friend of mine who's a strong, devout anti-vaxxer, and he really wanted to debate this with me. And I said, look, I've been vaccinated. I'm not trying to change your mind because you've thought about this and you're clearly quite passionate about it, but I've already been vaccinated. There's no takebacks. So I'm not sure why we're even having this conversation. Right. Like,
yeah.
So, and he thought about it for a bit and he said, well, I guess I'm just really scared. And I said, I can't really help you with that because I got vaccinated and I'm fine. And I'm no longer thinking about it that much.
Sure.
And I said, I certainly don't want to have a long, torturous debate about it.
No.
And so, we're struggling to even have those conversations. And it was a good approach with that particular friend because it caused him to pause and think, and he has since come back to me with more anti-vaxxing stuff. And he said, well, there's real problems with trust in the government. And I said, sure there is, but there's also problems with trust in the anti-vaxxer community. And so, the trust levels are really low all over.
Yes.
And so it's a challenge to put forth, even data now that the other side doesn't disagree with, or that we don't question profoundly.
Yeah, that's
so those.
I want to jump in just real quick, just because
Yeah.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but just with that point, that when I was going through, college, getting my bachelor's and even my master's degree, that, depending on the topic, depending on what you're writing about, thesis, I didn't do a dissertation or anything, but I found out that you can make data almost say anything that you want it to say. If you do it correctly and put down whatever facts and figures and charts and everything you want. So whatever you're arguing, you can almost say it by just whatever you want to say, but even by just leaving out certain little like demographics, for example, or whatever, just because that doesn't fit my narrative. So I don't need to include this, and like,
Right.
for example, I can't remember, kind of going back on the fitness game a little bit, but it was like 60s, 70s or 80s. But when they found out it was fully proven how the sugar was actually paying these certain studies to blame the obesity rates on, was it trans fats or something right then? And it wasn't sugar.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was like, well, and it just, what the narrative went on over there. Oh, we should be, it's the fats, not the sugar. Yeah, sugar's good. Don't worry about it. So that's all I wanted to say, was how I easily found out. And even today, when stuff is even being compiled and information is being compiled and you read the study, that it's like, it's okay to ask questions that are like, wait,
Right.
why did they do it this way? Okay, so what happened if they would have included, chart A, B, and C that they didn't include, or ask other people who, didn't take the vaccine versus who did take your vaccine, stuff like that. That was just,
Right.
and that was kind of mind blowing to me, just because that I always thought, oh, it's a study, it's right here, it's always true, and it's not always
Gotta believe it.
not always the case. Yes.
Right. And that's a great insight. And partly, there's a famous saying, and I can't remember who said it, but it's lies, damn lies, and statistics.
I like that.
And you're right. We can, so my now ex-wife and I disagreed about sending my son to French immersion here in Canada. And she said, you haven't done any research. And so she was right. I hadn't done as much research as I could have. So I looked at a study, and it basically said, kids in French immersion do better on English composition than their peers, and they're as good as them on everything else.
Wait, what is French?
So,
real quick.
Well, it's teaching a kid all their basic skills. So math, reading, writing, everything in French rather than English.
Okay, I've never heard of that. Okay.
You shouldn't have.
Oh, okay.
So, because my experience with it is it does a terrible job of teaching them some of those basic fundamental skills that they need in terms of mathematics and science and some of those other things, because they're struggling to translate while they're trying to learn this other thing as well. And so I took a look at the study and I showed it to her, and she goes, yeah, see, there you go. They do just as well. I said, now look at the footnote. And the footnote said that children in French immersion came from families with higher socioeconomic backgrounds, higher education levels, smaller class sizes, and they were screened for learning disabilities. And so those classes were doing just as well as classes with kids who were having profound learning disabilities, came from disadvantaged homes. I said, so they have pulled them down from being what they should be, which is excelling in all these topics, and made them average. And so it's that notion of critical thinking that we seem to be missing a lot of, that notion of questioning some of these results.
Yes.
And, thinking critically about how these stories are framed for us by the media or by people who have a self-interest. And, the places that they focus. And so recently we've seen kerfuffle between, Trump has complained about finding that was released recently about Twitter and Biden's son, right, and his laptop.
Yeah, the 100
and
got it.
Right.
Yes.
And so the focus that he has, and that Fox News and some of the other places have, is on the cover-up and the decision not to share some of this information at a time when it might have been meaningful or critical. And the focus that the other side has is on Trump's response and his call to terminate the parts of the Constitution and just put him back in power. And so we've got this set of information in front of us, but we're seeing very different narratives pushed on us. And I'm not going to say which one is right or wrong. I'm just going to say that it's problematic that we're not getting the whole story and being allowed to decide for ourselves.
Yeah, well, that's what we should do. I mean, and that's another question though. And I've never been to Canada. Don't really know.
Okay.
Know a little bit about it. But
well, you're welcome anytime, buddy.
Well, once I get my passport, I'll come over there and check things out. I hear it's beautiful. But I guess my point is though, we don't have to go down an educational soapbox here, but is that also a thing with the world today where, we're being taught ultimately always what to think and not really how to think for ourselves. And so it's like, oh, go get your news from CNN, go get your news from Fox News. And also depending on which side you lean on, oh, I'm only going to watch Fox News, and whatever they say again
Right.
is the golden ticket. So, but instead of like, I guess we kind of touched on it a little bit earlier though, but hey, well, let me think about this in my own way rather than just what, and I don't even know who the big anchors on the shows are anymore, rather than just what they're telling me to. Let me take the facts and let me see
Right.
what I think about it.
Yeah. I think that so wow. I'm going to say something that may not be popular now, Chris.
That's okay. Well, that's what free speech on this show. Sandy.
Okay, so buddy, I think that the U.S. is systematically underinvested in education for exactly that reason. That they like people to not think too much,
Sure.
because it makes it easier for them to be controlled,
Well,
and it makes it easier for you to share the narrative with them.
well,
Um,
in terms like that, yes, I would agree that. And even looking on the educational system, it seems that, in my opinion, we've gone, and I'm 36 years old, so I don't know how school is going through K through 12 right now, but it seems that we are, and not we, I'm not, but the educational system is focused on mediocrity, and
right,
it's for example with kids growing up now playing the victimhood mentality and saying that, oh, it's too hard to get, like when I was in school, I think a 94 and up was an A, where I think now
right,
in some schools, I don't know how many of them, but I know some schools they've lowered the grade average down to where I think like a C is a 60 now or something like that.
right.
And I think that's the biggest problem we got going on in our country, kind of like, oh, and also with what you said though, is just that we're just laying down the terms of, hey, this is what you need to be doing, rather than just, oh, you didn't do it. Okay, we'll just make it better for you. That's okay. Don't worry.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so when I was working on my PhD at Duke, a lot of the American doctoral students were really big on they had memorized a lot of stuff, but there were some students from other countries, Israel in particular, where they've been thought to think very critically
Sure.
and approach problems from a bunch of different perspectives. And and what you were describing earlier was critical thinking, where you're asking questions about these different studies and saying, well, let me look at a different one, and who else has looked at this, and what are some of the smart questions that I could ask? And there seems to be a shortage of that.
I agree. And I don't know. And I think it's just what you just said, that even though the educational system there is flaws with it though, but it seems that also, I was reading another, I don't know if it was a study or if somebody talking on a podcast. He's a professor at Stanford, and he was talking about how,
Right.
I think at Cal Berkeley or UCLA or whatever, but they were saying like how much smarter some of the students there are compared to previous years, and they were attesting that just because of technology today, just where people were able to pull up information on their phones, screens anytime they want to, and they're able to retain some of that information. But I think it's a case by case scenario, just because, yes, that demographic or that population was able to do that. But then if we go towards, kids seem to be not as smart today just because of technology too at the same time. It's like a double-edged sword, I guess, is what I'm going.
Yeah, and one of my colleagues has talked about the fact that their social skills have become profoundly stunted.
Of course.
And so by creating safe spaces in and getting rid of playgrounds and those kinds of things, any place where there could be some kind of conflict, they have no experience having conflict, and so they've never developed those skills, and they don't know how to engage the world. Once they've left that sort of safe harbor of school, they really struggle to move into new environments and be resilient.
Is that because
Because
of
the first time,
protection from the parents?
go ahead.
Is that because of overprotection from the parents?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I think it's a change in social norms as well. And we're not really, we've removed the sort of practical experience of developing social skills and dealing with one another on the playground and learning how to collaborate or disagree. We haven't replaced it with anything. we're not teaching kids social skills or how to disagree or how to engage in ways that are productive and successful for them. And so, we see people just crumple at the first sign of adversity.
Yes. Yes, I agree. Especially lately. And I don't know, again, I don't know if that's part of COVID or just the world we live in today, but I think there's been a couple release or studies also released about, the cognitive decline, or that's, well, not decline maybe, but how some adolescents, their cognitive abilities have not been increased just because of COVID-19 and living through
Right.
that type of virus, or living through that type of quarantine life, I guess is what you should say.
Yeah. And so there's significant increases in mental health issues,
Yes.
significant increases in, failure to thrive for adolescents. And part of that is that they faced a different type of adversity. They have had a gap forced on them in terms of social interaction, and they're really quite stunted in a lot of ways. And we're talking generalities, right? So there's some who have thrived through it. I know my kids. So I teach them the model that I use for trust, and they've done extremely well. My older son has gone to Missouri on a baseball scholarship,
Nice.
and and Canada's a little more left leaning than the U.S. is,
Of course.
and Missouri's a little more right leaning than other parts of the U.S.
Of course.
And so he had sort of a couple of degrees of change, and then he's at a Baptist school, and we're not Baptist, and so there's all these reasons that he could have failed, and he has thrived there. He's been on the dean's list every year. He's on the varsity baseball team. He's doing well.
Good.
And a lot of it is because of his ability to build strong relationships and be resilient.
Well, that's a lot of it. I mean, knowing who you are as a person and knowing what your morals and your values are. And like, and you just said, you teaching him your trust model. I mean, and going to, I don't know how far Missouri's from where you're at, but I'm sure, I'm pretty sure it's a huge.
It's a fair ways.
Yeah. Fair ways. But going to, and even at a Baptist school where you said you're not Baptist. So, but he was able to put all those negative connotations aside and just saying, hey, I'm here to build relationships. I'm here to get on a dean's list and play baseball, And a lot of people, he seemed to be, and this may be reflect on you too, but looking at more of the positive aspect of it instead of, because it's so easy to focus on the negative things. Right there was three main ones, and just saying, well, what the hell, I go do that. But where it's just like, nah, screw all that. I'm just going to go play baseball, man, and get my and do big things. I mean, I'm not here to do this, and this. This is what I'm here to do.
Yeah, and he said, when somebody was yelling at him about you're going to hell and because you're not a Baptist and all this kind of stuff, he just said, the thought goes through my head of this person really cares about me. They're trying to save my soul. That's how much they care.
That's great. See, that's cool that he can put that spin on it and think of it like that, where most people would instantly just, I guess, curl up in a ball and go hide, I guess,
Right. And a lot of his cohort who went away to school only lasted for a semester or maybe a year, and they couldn't handle it. And
I applaud him.
My younger son had significant learning disability, and struggled with that. And he overcomes. He's someone who meets a challenge and overcomes it. And he had this experience when he was young. He was playing baseball, and it's the first time a kid was throwing to him, and he drilled him right in the face.
Oh no.
And so after that, he's terrified, right? And so he backs out as the kid's winding up. And eventually he's got, elbow pads and shoulder pads and a helmet with a mask. And like, there are medieval knights that went into combat with less gear on, right? And the other parents are like, oh, this is going to be so hard for you to watch. You've got to, I feel so bad for him. And I said, you've got the wrong story. I said, how often do we get to face something that truly terrifies us and have a chance to overcome?
Well, a lot of people don't even want to face that, even if they know it's going to be something to tear. They instantly, if there's a fork in the road, like, oh, this is going to be the hard way. Nope, not doing it. Nope, gonna take these.
Yeah. And his last at bat, because he never wanted to play baseball again, but his last at bat of the season, he got a base hit. And the fans from both teams gave him a standing ovation.
That's awesome.
And I said, your story is you're someone who overcomes.
Yes.
And this is part of being, their dad. I have a relentlessly positive story about them. And I interpret the world and I help them interpret the world through that positive lens. And so I'm a safe harbor from which they can take risks. They can go out in the world, they can fall down, they can get knocked around, but there's always a safe place for them.
Well, it's also they can learn from you just because, going full circle here back to where you started at, being in a car crash and being hit by the fan over the head. I mean, you could have easily just, well, nah, I'm just going to go ahead and just lay around and do nothing.
I'm going to lay down.
Yeah, I'm just going to lay down. Or you could decide, hey, I'm going to get up. I'm going to go get my Ph.D. I'm going to go write a book. I'm going to go build, this thing on trust and make it something that, give these ideas and ideologies to people and learn to trust and stuff like, because, and when when your father went through those kind of things, it's like, well, hell, I'm not, if he did it, I want to do it too. I'm not going to sit here down, what is that going to, and then once reach that challenge and you take it on and you beat it or accept it or whatever you want to say, then you get that kind of momentum of success right there, just saying, hey, I can do this. And you get those wins that builds some stuff off and you start rolling with that. So yes. That's
and my aspiration is no less than making the world a better place.
I love it.
You know what? I've had some really profound impact with some of the clients I've worked with. I think my favorite couple of stories are around dads who were estranged from their kids, who I worked with, who were able to completely turn around those relationships.
Yes.
And, powerful, right? And life altering for folks. But I felt like I was dropping small grains of sand in the ocean. And what I need is people like you and your listeners to come alongside and pick up great big rocks and help me make waves.
Of course.
And that's why I wrote the book, so that I could share the model and show people how to actually pull those levers. It's why I built the masterclass. It's why I do the work that I do. The dedication for my book is that my sons make me want to be a better person, and they want me to make the world a better place.
I love that, Darryl. I think it's a good way to take this podcast home right there on that. Right there. That's a good note to end this on. So, but before you go, if you want to plug your book or plug your masterclass or just anything in general you want to promote, feel free to do that. If you want people to find you, all that good stuff.
So you can find me at trustunlimited.com. That's my website. There's a link to the book, Building Trust, Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World, or you can find it on Amazon or anywhere you order books. The masterclass is on the website. Reach out to me if you have questions. I'm a terrible businessman, but I love to help people. And so if folks could get the book, read it, start applying the concepts. That's the mission for me.
Is that, and real quick, if somebody, like I said, with me felt like I haven't trust issues my entire life, would that be one of the first things you would get somebody going into the right direction, is read the concepts and start utilizing them?
I would, and start thinking about it in terms of what questions would I ask to make myself more comfortable. First thing I do is go to my blog section, because there's free articles there. There are other podcasts, so other things that I've talked about. But there's articles you can go and look at and read, see the way I think about things. But yeah, find the book, read it, leave a review if you could, help spread the word. Of
course. Well, Darryl, thanks for being here. I'm glad we had this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Me too, brother.
Got some good pearls and gems, and thanks again, man. So,
thank you so much for having me.
Yes. All right. So, you good? Anything else you want to get out, or are we good?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, cool. Well, all right, folks, you heard it. All that good stuff. You know where to find Darryl now. Thank y'all. We're out of here. See you next time.